This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm speaking to you from my hometown Helensburgh today. It's about 25 miles northwest of Glasgow and sits on the River Clyde. And it's raining. Again. I know it's a common trait in Scotland, but before we start criticising the Scottish weather, just think of all the whisky that our delicious water goes to make. For such a tiny country of only 5.5 million people, we have 133 distilleries. Now you know why. Plenty water. And if you missed my podcast series on whisky, including Scotland's top whisky guru Charles MacLean, then listen to them now through my website. So what do fairies, those small mystical creatures with wings, and the Church of Scotland have in common? It seems an unlikely union perhaps, but one that was very real in the small town of Aberfoyle that I'll be discussing in this podcast. Today we are going to travel from Lowland to the Trossachs, an area of natural beauty and a part of the Stirling and Trossachs National Park. There's wonderful forests, mountains and lochs, and we'll be passing through a town with the oldest pub in Scotland. There's a number of lochs in the Trossachs, one of which is called Loch Katrine, and I'll tell you why. And I'll also be discussing one of Scotland's most famous writers, Sir Walter Scott, whose name was given to a paddle steamer on the famous Loch Katrine, whose location is used in his famous poem Lady of the Lake. The Trossachs area was also the stomping ground of one of Scotland's most famous vagabonds, Rob Roy, and you will learn where the term blackmail comes from. Well, if you're new to my podcasts, I try to share with you an experience, albeit virtually, of the real Scotland, its people, its customs and traditions, and some of the amazing places to visit. And there are many. There's castles, palaces, or the beautiful landscapes amongst the mountains and the glens. What I try to do in these virtual journeys is to share with you all that Scotland has to offer. And if you intend to visit this wonderful country at some stage in the future, perhaps your tour might be shaped by some of what you discover here. Do please visit my website www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk to hear more of my tours and also to see some of the great photos I've taken associated with all of my own journeys around Scotland. Thank you to the listeners who enjoyed my last podcast from Mallock to Fort William on the Jacobite Express, or the Hogwarts Express. That's the train that was used in the filming of Harry Potter on his way to Hogwarts School, and the fabulous footage of the train going over the Glenfinnan Viaduct. And also thank you for the kind comments about the video that I took of the viaduct and which can be seen on my website media section. And Jim from Ottawa, glad to hear you enjoyed the experience when you travelled last year on this very special train, especially the Harry Potter wannabes running down the train aisle with their black capes, large rimmed glasses and wands in their hand. You should try to relive your own youth next time, Jim, and get dressed up yourself for the occasion. Whatever way you intend to enjoy Scotland, then I hope that by listening to this podcast and by viewing my monthly video podcast, you get a feel for what this magical land of the Scots has to offer you. So I'd now like you to relax wherever you are and thoroughly enjoy this third series of your Unique Scotland tour from Loch Lomond to the Trossachs. If you're at home and enjoying a wee dram, then I raise my glass to you with the traditional Gaelic Scottish toast, Slán Java. Well, we had a very comfortable night at the wonderful Inverloch Castle Hotel, and after a sumptuous breakfast we depart Fort William for the south and our onward journey to the Trossachs. For those followers who have listened to Podcast 5, my mini touring trilogy from Edinburgh to Inverness and back to Edinburgh, you will remember the journey from Fort William to Loch Lomond, so I won't repeat it here. For those that have not listened to Podcast 5 and want to catch up, then go to my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk and click onto podcasts to listen to that episode. So, having driven to Loch Lomond and stayed at lodge on the loch overnight, we are now heading south once more, and we have the pleasure of Loch Lomond on our left-hand side as we continue our journey. You can also find one of my videos that I recently shot on a visit to Loch Lomond and Luss on my website and also on YouTube under Loch Lomond Battles and Clans. Loch Lomond is the largest of the Scottish lochs at almost 25 miles long, and as we head south we are just coming to the end of the loch when we turn left to head east towards Stirling. Our previous trip took us south towards Glasgow and then on to Edinburgh, but this diversion will take us into the heart of southern Scotland and the beautiful region known as the Trossachs. Just before we turn left, on our left-hand side is the 5-star hotel called Cameron House, and it's interesting to see how a former Scottish manor house can be transformed into a 5-star hotel. And probably one of the reasons is its location, right on the banks of Loch Lomond. The house was first built as a private home for Sir James Smollett in the mid-1700s and increased in size to a modern baronial stone castle in 1830 with peaked gables and decorative turrets. Personalities such as Boswell and Johnson, Lord Louis Mountbatten, Winston Churchill, the Empress Eugenie of France, they all visited the castle when it was a baronial home. Well, it was sold in 1985 to the De Vere Group, a hotel chain, and they turned it into a grand hotel, and it's remained a hotel ever since. Sadly, you can't stay there at the moment because it was badly damaged by fire 2 years ago and is being rebuilt, with an opening hopefully in mid-2021. In the grounds there's a small jetty, and when you visit you may be surprised to see a seaplane sitting alongside. This is the Loch Lomond Seaplane, and was the UK's first commercial seaplane service. It is super, and I went up in it a couple of years ago, and I have to say the experience of seeing the mountains and lochs at relatively low altitude is amazing. The views on a good day are breathtaking, and I believe it's something that everyone must do when they visit Scotland. Gives them a real taste of Scotland, the ruggedness and the beauty from above. Quite magnificent. Well, we continue on and have just turned left at the Stony Mullen roundabout with an interesting sculpture in the centre. There's a ring of wooden posts with wires joining them together, and within the wires are figures of flying geese. Intriguing and a good indication of the loch you're about to see when travelling from the south. The first small town we come to is Balloch, which sits at the southern end of Loch Lomond. Indeed, there's a number of cruises from Balloch up Loch Lomond. Interestingly, the village is also home to the Dunkirk vessel Skylark, which helped rescue 600 troops during World War II from the beaches of Dunkirk. Well, as we drive on, we pass the turning to Balloch Country Park that borders the loch with Balloch Castle in the grounds. This is the new Balloch Castle, as the old castle from the 13th century was demolished. It's a pity because the old castle and estate used to belong to the Lennox family, whose chiefs were the original Earls of Lennox in the 15th and 16th centuries. And they have a fascinating history of intrigue and murder, mind you, which clan doesn't, and the story is worthy of a podcast of its own. So, note to self, podcast on medieval Scottish families. But just to give you a little insight into the Lennox history, it was in 1488 that John Stuart, Lord Darnley, assumed the title of Earl of Lennox. Then he was killed at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. The next Lord Darnley was Henry Stuart, and he was the husband to Mary Queen of Scots. Well, poor Lord Darnley met a sticky end when he was murdered in Edinburgh, probably by Mary's lover, Bothwell. And this effectively sealed Mary's fate as well, as she was forced to abdicate. She was then imprisoned for nearly 20 years and died at the hands of an executioner on the orders of Queen Elizabeth I in 1587 at Fotheringay Castle. I mean, you just couldn't make it up. But that is part of Scotland's very turbulent history, and interesting to reflect upon as we pass the original seat of the Lennox family. Well, we continue on and pass through the small farming village of Gartaharn, also on the banks of the south side of Loch Lomond. I mention it because there's a small hill called Duncrine Hill, or locally it's called the Dumpling. It actually just looks like a dumpling. It is a terrific vantage point for viewing Loch Lomond, and on a clear day you can see for miles up the loch and take in the fabulous mountain of Ben Lomond as well. I climbed the hill a couple of months ago and shot a video connected with Loch Lomond and Luss and the Cahoon clan. It's the one I've just mentioned, so if you go to my website or to YouTube under the title of Loch Lomond Battle and Clans, you can view the video there. It gives you an insight into Loch Lomond, the lovely village of Luss, and the 17th century battles fought between the MacGregors and Cahoons. And whereas in the last podcast we visited Cahoon territory, this podcast we will be going right into the heartland of the MacGregors. As we continue along the road, the A811, we pass through the village of Drimmen, spelled Dry Men. It's picturesque with a village green at its centre, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, Drimmen was used as a stopover point for Highland cattle drovers that came down from the Highlands to sell their beasts in the markets of the lowlands. In the centre of the village is the Clachan Inn, which claims to be the oldest pub in Scotland, having first been licensed in 1734. It's said that the first licensee was Mistress Gow, supposedly the sister of the infamous Rob Roy MacGregor, and more of him shortly. Today, a great number of people will know the village because it's on the route of the well-known West Highland Way, a walking route of 94 miles, or 154 kilometres, from Milngavie, just north of Glasgow, to Fort William. Well, we continue along the A811, also known in this part of Scotland as the Stirling Strait, because if you continued along the road, you'd eventually come to the town of Stirling. But that's for the next podcast. Well, about 5 miles out of Drimmen, we take a small road on the left, the A81, towards Aberfoyle and into the heart of the Trossachs. The Trossachs generally refers to an area of wooded valleys, or glens in Scotland, hills and lochs lying between Loch Lomond in the west and Stirling in the east. The name is actually taken from a small wooded glen that lies in the centre of this area but is now generally applied to the wider area. You often expect to have to travel to the Highlands to get the glens and lochs experience, but this area is like a microcosm of the typical Highland landscape, with the beauty and splendour of mountain scenery and glistening water of the lochs. While much of the Trossachs area is protected by various conservation regulations. Presently, we're in the middle of the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, but the area we're about to enter is also the Great Trossachs Forest National Nature Reserve. And because it's relatively near population centres such as Glasgow and Stirling, it's become a popular place to walk and cycle for locals as well as tourists. Well, our route along the road takes us past the Lake of Monteith, with historical connections to Mary Queen of Scots once more, who was hidden at Inchmahome Priory when she was a child to escape the clutches of Henry VIII, who wanted her to marry his son. Now, I'll be doing a series on Mary Queen of Scots later, so more of that in future podcasts. Well, after about 25 minutes we arrive in the village of Aberfoyle, and it's got a population of about 1,000. And tourists were first attracted to the village after the publication of Sir Walter Scott's epic poem, The Lady of the Lake, and that describes the beauty of Loch Katrine, and more of that shortly. In effect, Aberfoyle became known as the gateway to the Trossachs. In recent times, Aberfoyle has also become known for the largest Go Ape adventure course in the UK, featuring a zip line or death slide. The village is simply a row of shops and houses along the main road, not uncommon of small villages that grew up on the back of a road that supplied travellers with all their needs in food and ale. There's a Scottish Wool Centre and also a Trossachs Discovery Centre, and those are both worth a visit. On the southern side of the village, just as you enter, there's a small hillock called Doon Hill, and it's this hill and the local Auld Kirk, or Old Church, whose ghostly connections that I want to tell you about. The story takes place in the 1690s and revolves around the local minister at the time who, interestingly enough, was called the Reverend Robert Kirk. He was born in 1644 and is well remembered for the first translation into Scottish Gaelic, the Book of Psalms. However, he is most remembered for his 1691 book entitled the secret commonwealth of elves, fauns and fairies. He'd been researching fairies at the time, and the book provided several personal accounts and stories of people who claimed to have met these mythical beings. And it was not long after the book's publication that the Reverend Kirk died in unusual circumstances. Now, Kirk truly believed that the local Doon Hill that I've just mentioned in Aberfoyle village was indeed the gateway to the secret commonwealth, or the land of the fairies. He himself visited the hill regularly, taking daily walks from his manse. And there's a story that the fairies of Doon Hill became angry with the Reverend Kirk for giving away the secrets of these legendary people and visiting them in their own domain, so they decided to imprison him in Doon Hill. One morning, the Reverend Kirk was found on the hillside, simply in his nightshirt, and was taken home by the locals. Sadly, he died soon afterwards and was buried in the Auld Kirk graveyard, where you can still see his grave today. But that is not the end of the story. It's been suggested that the fairies took his body away, and the coffin simply contains only stones. And on top of Doon Hill there's a large pine tree that's said to contain Kirk's imprisoned spirit. Now, this story was supported by his cousin Graham of Duckray, who claimed that the ghost of Reverend Kirk had visited him in the night and told him that he'd been carried off by the fairies. Now, Kirk's widow had been expecting a child, and he told his cousin Graham that his spirit would appear at the baptism of the child, and that he, Graham, was to throw an iron knife at the apparition which would free Kirk from the fairies' clutches. Well, sure enough, at the baptism of Kirk's child, his spectre appeared. But Graham was so shocked at the apparition that he failed to throw the knife, and Kirk's ghost faded away forever. Of course, to understand this sort of story, it has to be remembered in 16th century Britain, fairies were a source of fascination, fear, evil, and superstition for most people. Fairy belief was very important to the day-to-day lives of the common people, who saw many of the things that went wrong in their daily lives as attributable to these tiny, irascible, flying creatures. Of course, living in the 21st century, we can smile at the beliefs of our forefathers, but there are still many communities around the world where unseen forces determine the day-to-day lives of local people. And of course, superstition still exists in today's Scotland, and some of these superstitions are still connected to places like Doon Hill. Indeed, Doon Hill has a clootie tree. Now, a cloot is a cloth, and the forest on the hill has become a pilgrimage for visitors who believe that their wishes can be granted and illnesses cured by tying a piece of cloth or a cloot to the branches of local trees for the fairies to grant their wishes. So don't laugh too quickly at our 17th century ancestors. Well, as we leave the village and Doon Hill behind, heading north, we climb a steep hill out of the village into the heart of the Trossachs and the mountainous region of this area. The road we are using is called the Duke's Pass, as it was built by the Duke of Montrose as a private road in 1885 to allow him access to his estates. It was opened for public access in 1931 when the Forestry Commission acquired the land, and it was then possible for the public to take a northerly route from Aberfoyle to Loch Katrine over this stunning road. It reaches a height of about 750 feet, or 250 metres above sea level, and overlooks the lochs that we will be passing on our route. As we reach the summit of the road, we can see on the left-hand side the tip of Ben Venue at nearly 2,500 feet, or just under 750 metres high. At the summit of our route on the Duke's Pass there is a viewpoint that looks over Loch Drunkie and Loch Venacher. Loch Drunkie takes its name from the days when illicit distillation of whisky was commonplace in the Highlands and the out-of-the-way places in the lowlands. The excisemen, or gaugers as they were called, were always on the lookout for illicit pot stills, hidden in the forests and glens of Scotland. Legend has it that the pot stills around Loch Drunkie were well hidden, but if it was known that the excisemen were approaching, all the whisky in the stills was poured into this loch, and it became known as Loch Drunkie. We continue on, and when we reach a road junction we turn left and make our way to the Trossachs Pier complex and Loch Katrine. It's a 10-minute bumpy ride through the forest, and at the end of the road it opens up to a large car park with information boards and a cafe. Loch Katrine became famous on the back of Sir Walter Scott's poem Lady of the Lake, and more of that shortly. The loch itself is 8 miles long, is a freshwater loch, and has been the primary water reservoir for much of Glasgow since 1859. The Victorians were incredible engineers, and this reservoir is no exception. There's an aqueduct 25 miles long, 41 kilometres, 13 miles of tunnel, 21 kilometres, taking the water to a treatment plant to the town of Mulgai, which itself is 400 feet above sea level, and that is sufficient to provide the city its water without the need for pumping. Construction was started in 1855 and opened by Queen Victoria in 1859. The loch itself derives its name from the term Katrine, from the Gaelic Cathrara, a collective word meaning cattle thief. This was commonly referred to a band of fighting men, and in the 16th and 17th century, cattle thieving was commonplace. It's believed that the local clan, the MacGregors, led by Rob Roy MacGregor, was responsible for most of the cattle thieving in the vicinity. But Sir Walter Scott, in his book Rob Roy, painted a more sympathetic picture of this renegade, and you may have seen the film Rob Roy, that shows the gentler side of the man. He's often known as the Robin Hood of Scotland, but the truth of his activities is now lost in the legends that have been written and rewritten by many, especially Sir Walter Scott and William Wordsworth. Rob Roy, or Red Rob, in reference to his red hair, was born in 1671 and died aged 63 in Balquhidder, a small village about half an hour's drive north from Loch Katrine. Rob was certainly a freebooter and was involved in cattle stealing and blackmail. The word blackmail, by the way, comes from the word mail, which was used as an immunity from harassment on payment of a sum of money. The black refers to the colour of the cattle. Highland cattle were mostly black, so blackmail payments ensured that your cattle would not be taken by that particular clan, effectively protection money. In a previous podcast and my first video on Loch Lomond, I talked about the battle between the Cahoons of Loch Lomond and the MacGregors. Well, if you've listened to that podcast or seen the video, you remember that the MacGregors massacred the Cahoons and had an order of fire and sword against the clan, meaning that any man or clan could strike down any MacGregor that he met. These penal laws were introduced in 1693 when Rob and many of his clansmen changed their name. Rob took the name of Campbell. Indeed, his close association with the Campbell clan, and especially the Duke of Argyll, probably saved him on a number of occasions, especially as he was almost constantly at war with the Duke of Montrose, a sworn enemy of Argyll. Rob lived through the Jacobite era of 1715 and was trusted by neither side. That was his character, to support the side that was most advantageous to the MacGregors. He was eventually imprisoned in Newgate Prison and sentenced to transportation to Barbados. Lady Luck, however, remained with him, and he was pardoned, returning to Scotland and finally settling in Balquhidder. Turning to Loch Katrine itself, it's the fictional setting for the Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake, and also the subsequent opera by Rossini, La Donna del Lago. Scott actually began writing The Lady of the Lake in 1809 while holidaying with his wife Charlotte and daughter Sophia in the Trossachs and close to Loch Katrine. I found it wasn't an easy read, but after 2 attempts it really does grip you, so if you're going to give it a go, then persevere. In terms of the plot, it concerns the Scottish King James V and his struggle with the powerful Douglas clan, who had held extreme power during preceding monarchies. I'll be going into more details of the Stuart Kings in later podcasts, but if you're interested in a gory story now, then look up The Black Dinner, which involves intrigue and murder of 2 young Douglases at Edinburgh Castle. Turning to the specific poem, the king had banished the entire Douglas clan from his kingdom. James Douglas, the Earl of Bothwell, takes refuge on an island in the middle of Loch Katrine with his daughter Ellen. At the beginning of the poem, a mysterious knight calling himself Fitzjames arrives at the castle and is granted hospitality. Malcolm Graham, a knight loyal to the king, helps protect the Douglases and is facing attack from royal forces. Douglas gives himself up at Stirling Castle to avoid a massacre and is arrested. Royal forces decide to attack Loch Katrine's stronghold anyway, and Fitzjames, who happens to be the king in disguise, and who has fallen in love with Ellen, gives her a ring for her safety. So, what happens to the incarcerated Douglas? What happens to Ellen? And does the ring save her and the Douglases from doom? Well, if you want to know the rest of the story, you'll have to read the poem, or drop me a line, and I'll let you in on the secrets myself. The poem was published in 1810 and was really the pinnacle of Scots popularity. Its sale broke all records in the UK, and Scots' fame spread beyond GB to the USA. Indeed, I am often surprised that this man is still read today by people from all over the world, but very few of my own countrymen have studied this great man. The connection with Sir Walter Scott and Loch Katrine continues today, and there's a steamboat called the SS Sir Walter Scott that has provided sailings in the loch since 1900. Oil-fired vessels are not permitted to sail the waters of the loch due to the danger of pollution to the drinking water of Glasgow, so coal-fired steamboats were the answer. It was converted to biodiesel in 2007 and continues to provide local tourist transportation between Trossachs Pier and Storie during the summer. There's also a super walk along the banks of the loch, but it does not go all the way around, so be prepared to retrace your steps. Well, as we leave Loch Katrine behind, we head east again and pass Loch Katrine. As we pass Loch Katrine on the right-hand side, there's a lovely old church called the Trossachs Church that sits out on its own near the loch. I recall stopping there once with a friend of mine who had a lovely collie dog named Holly, and a more obedient dog you'd never find. We got out of the car, approached the church and opened the gate to go in. Holly refused point blank to enter the grounds, which was effectively a graveyard surrounding the old church. And no cajoling or offers of treats could persuade this dog to enter, and it sat at the gate barking like it had never barked before. And because of the noise of the barking we had to leave, and Holly ran back to the car, jumped in, and was silent. All very spooky. We drive on, and we arrive at the Brig o' Turk, which means the Bridge of the Boar. So it's assumed that wild boar were hunted here. In fact, it's also suggested that the last wild boar in Scotland was killed here. The brig, or bridge, is built over the fingerless water that leads into Loch that we will be passing shortly. Over the years, visitors have broken their journeys here at Brig o' Turk, including Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And the village is also associated with famous artists and poets such as Millis, Ruskin, William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy. One lovely story of this village, the Brig o' Turk, that I recall is the story of the bicycle tree. And indeed there is a tree that has grown up and totally enveloped a bicycle over the years. The story is that a young man from the village went off to war, leaving his bicycle leaning up against a young tree. What happened to him is not known, but he never returned to claim his bicycle, and over the years it became part of this incredible tree. Well, it's an apocryphal story perhaps, but intriguing nevertheless. As we drive on to our overnight stop near Doon Castle, we pass Loch Venacher, and I love to stop for a meal at the restaurant called Venacher Lochside, which provides superb views over the loch both inside and on an outside veranda which is available when the weather permits. The award-winning contemporary Scottish cuisine beautifully complements this idyllic setting, and it's a real pleasure to rest in such a peaceful place. After a lovely meal, we are now heading for a resting place for the night, and we'll be staying at a glorious hotel not far from Doon Castle, and we'll visit Doon Castle tomorrow. The hotel is called Cromlix. Cromlix is a Victorian mansion once owned by Captain Arthur Drummond Hay. It was built in 1880 and subsequently operated as a hotel. It was bought by the tennis superstar Andy Murray in 2013 and has been turned into a fabulous 5-star, 15-bedroom luxury hotel. The hotel is situated in 34 acres of secluded woodlands and garden grounds with its own chapel and loch. There's a Shearoo restaurant using seasonal, locally sourced produce, and I for one am looking forward to dinner this evening. Well, it's been a great day, and I hope you've enjoyed our trip from Loch Lomond to the Trossachs. Tomorrow we'll be going on to Stirling and we'll visit the ruined 14th century castle of Doon, which some of you may know as Castle Leoch from the Outlander series. It's been a great trip around the Trossachs, and I have enjoyed taking you with me on this short journey. This podcast is one of my Touring Scotland trilogies, and this is the second episode of my third series. So if you've enjoyed this journey and would like to hear my previous tours, you can find them on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, or the usual channels such as Spotify, Google, TuneIn, Apple, etc., under my brand name Unique Scotland. I've also visited all the places I talk about, and I've put up some lovely photos of those places on my website, so do have a look. Also, please do get in touch if there is any other subject you'd like me to cover, or just say hi sometime. Well, it's time to sign off, and as I relax in the sumptuous surroundings of the Cromlix Hotel, I'd like to raise my glass to you, wherever you are, and give you the Gaelic toast, Slanjava.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive scottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.